Good morning, everyone. So it's 10 o'clock, so we're going to start their presentation. Good morning. Thank you for joining the second technical assistance session for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities in the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Programs. Today, we will be having a benefit cost overview presented by Dr. Shane Parson of AECOM. So before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping items I wanted to discuss. First, we will be recording this session for note-taking purposes, and it will also be published to the MEMA Mitigation Branch website for reference. Two, please ensure that your line is muted. If you are having any technical difficulties unmuting yourself, to ask a question, you can use Control-Shift-M on your computer or *6 on the phone if you're calling in. And then finally, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box on the right-hand side so they can be addressed throughout the presentation. Jane, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So to start with introductions on the MEMA side, my name is Kristen Forty. I'm the lead hazard mitigation specialist, and we have Jaleesa Tate, who is our state hazard mitigation officer. We have a great AECOM team along with MES who have been assisting us throughout this grant cycle. And finally, thank you to all the communities across the state that have joined today. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Shane Parson.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So what we're going to be doing today, this is by no means going to be a complete and thorough every single part of benefit cost presentation, but we wanted to give an overview of what benefit cost analysis is, talk a little bit about some of the types of mitigation projects that have pre-calculated benefits versus ones where you have to actually do a more detailed analysis. Then get a little bit into the actual components or parts of a benefit cost analysis. Talk a little bit about the cost side, what benefits are, because I think that's confusing for a lot of folks. And also talk a little bit about the economic calculations and just why, when you do a benefit cost and you have all these different factors they want to include, why those are included. So we'll get a little bit into that. And then do a little bit of a deep dive into the types of benefits. So benefits, I won't bury the lead. Benefits are avoided damages. So what are all the different types of damages or the types of impacts that we can put dollars on? So we'll talk through those different types and how they relate to some of the different hazard types that you might be looking at doing mitigation projects for. So we'll do a brief overview, focusing more so on flood and wind, but also highlight some of the other typical project types as well. Do a really brief overview of the BCA software. For those that are on here that might have done mitigation projects over the past, let's say, 5 years or more, you might be familiar with the standalone benefit cost software, and that's recently transitioned to an actual Excel-based approach of the toolkit. So we'll show a couple of screenshots of kind of that new Excel-based approach and how it works. And then talk a little bit about, but not get into any depth on FEMA Go, and specifically talk about the sections in the FEMA Go application where benefit cost analysis information is needed. And then at the very end, give you some advice, some tricks and tips of just things that we've seen over time, things to watch out for. A little bit of my background. So I work with AECOM out of the Germantown, Maryland office. I actually live in Virginia, but I have Maryland roots. My mom's side of the family is from Caroline County, Maryland, over on the Eastern Shore. So my parents would ship off my sister and I every summer for a week to go over and stay with my granddad and my granny and hang out at their farm and go to the beach. And so I've got a lot of fond memories of the Eastern Shore and going and getting crabs and just that whole experience with me. So I've even though right now I live in the mountains in Virginia, definitely Eastern Shore has a spot in my heart. So, and as we go through this, I will try to bring out some examples and again, not make it just a dry sort of slides only type of thing. We'll have a time for questions at the end. And as folks mentioned before, you can also type those into the chat as well as we go through this. So let's start off with what benefit cost really is. So the main way to think of benefit cost is it is a numeric way to look at cost effectiveness, comparing the cost of doing a project with benefits. And as I mentioned before, when we think of benefits as avoided losses, it's really that comparison. If I'm spending money to do a project, is that money less than the benefit or the avoided damages that comes from spending it? So that's, I mean, at its heart, that's what it really is meant to be a comparison of. When we talk about a benefit cost analysis or a BCA, one of the acronyms we often use is a BCR, which is a benefit cost ratio. And that's just dividing the dollar amount of benefits by the dollar amount of costs. And if the ratio is 1.0 or greater, then it's considered cost effective. As a past reviewer, I've also often got the question, well, if it's 0.99, is that cost effective? And in many cases, when you have a benefit cost ratio that's really close, there's often additional benefits that can be looked at and included. So really, when we think about that 1.0 threshold, it's really dependent on how many sources of benefits you use and how much time you spend putting that estimate together. So that's another thing to always think about, is that a lot of times the benefit cost analysis tends to be iterative, where you do some initial estimates, you see what your numbers are like. If the numbers are good, then you may not add additional benefits, where if they're a little lower, then you may have to look at additional sources and at some point actually make a call. Hey, I've done all I could and my benefit cost ratio is 0.2. This may not be a good project. This may not be one that I would want to look at. So that's kind of overview of benefit cost. So why do we do this? I get this question quite a bit. It's the law is what it comes down to. So in the enabling legislation behind both FEMA and all their various grant programs, there are statements in those that essentially say FEMA funded, federally funded mitigation projects have to be cost effective, need to be shown to be cost effective. And when they use that term, that means that the benefit cost ratio needs to be 1.0. For the BRIC program and the applications this year, the benefit cost analysis and the cost effective language only apply to actual mitigation projects themselves. So if you think about some of the other categories of things that you can apply for, such as plans and those sort of things, you don't have to go through some convoluted way to say this plan will do X, Y, Z, but it's really meant to be those projects, the actually, either buying of property or building of a flood wall, those sort of things, is where a benefit cost ratio of 1.0 is required. So what are some of the approaches for benefit cost? So typically when you're doing a project, you would use FEMA's benefit cost software or toolkit that we'll be looking at. You would enter data that's required for that hazard type and that project type. However, FEMA's realized over time that certain classes of projects and certain types of projects at a national level, because that legislation, that cost-effective language is really meant to apply nationally, and we take it down to the individual project. But what FEMA's done is they've actually found out that they can pre-calculate benefits and use some reasonable statistical analysis. And so they've actually come up, you can see on this bulleted list here, of certain project types where they can pre-calculate benefits and say, if a certain thing is under this dollar amount, then we can make a reasonable assumption that the project would be cost effective and wouldn't require a separate project specific benefit cost analysis. Probably the two that would impact Maryland the most would be the acquisitions elevations, and I'll show you a table here on the next slide. And then also residential hurricane wind retrofits are the main ones that in Maryland would apply. If you're in the Midwest, tornado safe rooms, there's quite a number you can imagine in, say, Oklahoma, that a tornado safe room probably wouldn't be hard to justify just because the hazards are so high in there. Another thing to keep in mind and bolded on this slide is that if you've had structures that have been recently substantially damaged, and it could be from a flood event, but anything that's in the special flood hazard area or the MAP FEMA floodplain, that's another case where there's an actual exemption that would say that a benefit cost analysis would assume 1 on that. So that's something else to keep in mind. If you're in the aftermath of a large disaster and you have a number of structures that have been designated substantially damaged, those automatically could be considered a passing for a benefit cost. So what are some of these thresholds for these pre-calculated benefits? For acquisitions elevations, there's dollar amounts listed here in this table. There's FEMA memos, and we'll talk about this, getting a hold of those later on that talk about what that's applied to. Big thing to keep in mind, especially with an acquisition, is that dollar amount is project cost, not just property acquisition cost. And at times we always forget that it's not just buying the building, but it's buying the land that the building is on. So if you're in an area, again, think about some of the coastal areas of the state where the structures themselves, might not be worth all that much, but the land could be. You still might be looking at a project cost or an individual acquisition cost that would be higher than this threshold. So what these pre-calculated benefits mean is if you have these project costs that are lower than you can see the values for acquisition or elevation, you don't have to do a separate BCA. But if they're over that, then you would have to go through the process of documenting it. And it doesn't mean that let's say an acquisition for a given structure is $300,000. It doesn't mean it won't be cost effective. It just means that you can't be exempted out of doing a benefit cost analysis for those. Then the other category down here, this residential hurricane wind in parts of Wacomico and Worcester counties. You've got some values that are also included in as part of that. Tornado safe rooms, there are no pre-calculated values in Maryland. If you go further west or in the Midwest, some of those states do have that. So that's pre-calculated benefits. So what are some of the components then in doing a benefit cost analysis? Obviously the cost, benefits, which we'll take the deep dive in, and then some other factors which I've kind of lumped in is economic calculations. So the math that goes into actually being able to come up with a benefit cost ratio. And those kind of the three main factors are the discount rate, the project useful life, and there's this idea of a project design or recurrence interval associated with project effectiveness. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of how the project useful life and that project design, how those things are a little different and sometimes get confused. So project costs, I think this is the one that most people are most familiar with. So this would be the cost of doing a mitigation project and should include all costs associated with actually conducting the project. So if you think about the example shown here as a house elevation, it's not just the cost of bringing in a contractor to sit there and jack up the house and then build a new foundation, but it's everything from mobilizing equipment to getting permits to doing the engineering design. So anything associated with that project should be included in as part of costs. A big part of that, and often as a reviewer, where there might be some challenges, comes in with maintenance costs. If you're doing a project, so let's say you're doing an acquisition where you're actually buying a house and getting rid of it. Those project like that where you're removing something, unless it's a special case, usually you're not going to have a whole lot of maintenance after you do that acquisition. But you can imagine like a house elevation, would want to go around and do some level of maintenance over time related to that elevation, making sure that the foundation is settled correctly and doesn't have any issues. If you think about it as a block foundation, that you don't have differential settling and those things. If you're doing a project like a flood wall or something that has moving parts, then that probably needs annual inspections and other sorts of things. Those maintenance costs are needed for a benefit cost analysis, but as part of your grant application, you're not actually asking FEMA for those future monies. So one of the ways as a reviewer that when I would go in and look at the costs is I would say, okay, for all of the lump sum current day cost values, there's a line for that in the software. I would want to make sure that cost value matches up with the other parts of the grant application. But then if I add in a maintenance cost associated with doing a certain project type, that's actually going to add on to an overall cost that the benefit cost analysis uses. So the cost, so let's say you're applying to FEMA, total project cost is $2 million. If you add on additional maintenance costs in the benefit cost, the value that's shown may be $2.2 million. It may actually be more than what you're applying for to FEMA because you've included maintenance. So that's something to keep in mind, that in benefit costs, those maintenance items or get added in even though you're not applying to FEMA for those dollar amounts. So that's the cost side of the equation. So the benefits, and here's a kind of a more detailed breakdown of how the math works, is in fact, I'll just read this. So the benefits are any future costs or losses that can be avoided by completing the project. And the way that they're calculated is looking at losses before mitigation minus losses after mitigation. So what does that mean? Losses before mitigation represents kind of the way things are now. So if a given flood comes through, how much damage is occurring to buildings or to a bridge or to a road now? And then when I put in this project, how am I predicting that those losses are going to be reduced? A major concept and a place where, as a reviewer, we often see folks not give proper documentation is they're very tempted to have the losses after mitigation just be zero for every size of event. Very few projects are 100% effective across all sizes of storms. So usually, let's say where you're putting in a new culvert, and the old culvert was sized for only a 10-year storm, and now it's good for a 50-year. Well, if you have a huge 100-year, 500-year storm, having that culvert being slightly bigger is really not going to have that big of a difference at a really major storm event. So those losses after mitigation for that 100-year, 500-year, there may be no difference between the two. There may be no benefits for those large events, but most of the benefits come from avoiding damages at a 10-year or a 25-year event. So those are the challenges you have, is documenting those differences over different sizes of storms that may occur. But just know, other than an acquisition where that building is no longer there to be damaged, pretty much every other project type, you would expect some non-zero losses after mitigation to be included in. All right, so we got benefits, we got cost. How do we then get to a benefit cost ratio? How do we bring all this math together and make this work? The analogy that I always tend to use is most people are familiar with either like a house mortgage or buying a car on payments. So when you think about, like, let's say a house payment, and so you get a 30-year mortgage, and every month you are making a payment on that. So 30 times 12, those are your number of payments that you have. And when your mortgage is done at a certain interest rate, that then determines what you have to pay. If you want to pay, let's say, the same amount each month, that goes into an economic formula over all those payments, and it figures out, okay, each month I need to pay X amount. The benefit cost analysis works in a similar way, in that the benefits usually are annual. So every year, this project is going to avoid $1,000 of damage, $10,000 worth of damage. But my project costs are given as current day lump sum. If FEMA gives me this money, it's going to cost us $2 million to do this project. So how do I compare a lump sum with annualized payments going out? So I use math just like in the mortgage thing. But in order for that to work, I need to have something that allows me to take annual values and turn them into what we know as a net present value or current day value. So to get that to work, I need to know numbers of years or numbers of payments and a rate involved with that. So for benefit cost analysis, the rate idea is defined as the discount rate. And this is set by actually the federal government. And for projects like FEMA's and for most project types, there are some exceptions with certain federal agencies, but for FEMA, the current discount rate set by OMB is 7%. This is a set value, and so people look at that and they're going, that seems high. Like, shouldn't it be lower? Shouldn't it be? But really the idea of the 7%, it's not an inflation rate. It's not, the CPI, cost of living adjustment things. What it really is meant to be is this idea of time value of money, in that if I had $1,000 today and I could invest it or put it in common places, I could make a 7% return on that money over time. Again, there can be lots of arguments of whether or not that's the proper way to do this or not. But right now, that is established again in the federal legislation behind cost effectiveness, and are the rates that are used for FEMA projects. So that's built into all the tools. So you don't need to worry about that side of things. The part that you as an applicant, though, do need to take care of is this idea of a project useful life. So what this useful life really gets into is this estimated amount of time that this mitigation action will be effective or will last. The easiest way to describe this is to really think of it as how long the practice or the thing that you're doing. And let's think of our culvert example, how long that culvert will physically last. And you probably are all familiar in your communities. If you put in a corrugated metal pipe versus a concrete pipe versus box culverts, each of those last a different amount of time. The corrugated metal one may corrode over time. It may have, get physical damage to it. So those last a lower amount of time than like a concrete pipe, and those probably last a little less long than like box culverts. Every project type, and you can see on this slide here some of the default values that are allowed within the FEMA, within the software, have default values. So if I'm doing, let's say, a building elevation of a residential structure, the value of 30 years is the standard value for FEMA benefit cost. And I'll show you later where you can find these values within the software itself. So if you're doing a house elevation and you use a useful life of 30 years, there's going to be no questioning that that is a good value to use because it's the FEMA default. However, you notice here acceptable limits 30 to 50. If you feel that that elevation will actually last, if that foundation will last up to 50 years, you would need additional documentation and information to support that. But within this acceptable range, a reviewer would say, okay, this is a reasonable value. But if you come back with a residential house elevation with a useful life of 100 years, that in many cases would be outright rejected because it's outside of this acceptable limits range that's there. Now you notice public buildings, historical buildings can go higher, but those are constructed in a much different, a more kind of hardy way than your typical residential buildings that are included with these assumptions. So project useful life, think of project useful life as how long the practice will last. That is different, though, than project effectiveness. So the two examples that I give here, so think about a highway box culvert, is that it may have a project useful life of 50 years, but this culvert that you're designing may only pass up to a 25-year return period, or if you're familiar with some of the new language for that, a 4% annual chance. So project effectiveness deals with the hazard and how well a given project will withstand certain levels of hazards. With flooding, that often comes back to a flood elevation or a flood depth. With wind, that comes up to a wind speed. So a more severe event would have higher wind speeds. So for instance, when you put shutters on, are they designed for 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour? That will then determine its effectiveness, its project effectiveness as what's in there. So you could have examples where, like with this culvert, the project effectiveness or the return period is less than the project useful life. Or you could have a residential house is elevated, project useful life is 30 years, but you're elevating it to the 500-year return period flood elevation. So here's an instance where the effectiveness value or the return period is higher in terms of years than the project useful life. So it can get confusing of these things. The way that I keep track is project useful life is simply how long the measure lasts. The project effectiveness goes back to what the design is and what we're trying to prevent. And this project effectiveness is really what drives all your benefits. Because if you're only, in the culvert case, if you're only putting in a culvert that will carry up to the 25-year event, I would expect in the benefit cost analysis at the 50-year, the 100, the 500, to see no difference with that culvert in place, or very small difference, because it's only designed to carry that event. But for a 10-year or the 25, I would see a difference in before and after damages. So that's where this project effectiveness and the return period, or the effectiveness of how it withstands that hazard, is really the driving concept behind documenting and supporting a lot of your benefit calculations. All right, so benefit types. So the concept to keep in mind with benefits, again, we talked about avoided damages, is it really starts at the physical damages to either a structure, or in the case of life safety, to people. So it starts off with, this hazard has occurred and it breaks something. In the benefit cost software, the two main categories of physical damage that are almost always assumed are the building, so the actual, framework, foundation, roof, those fixed permanent parts of the building, and then the contents of the building. So those are the two primary physical damage types that are included. And then as that so that damage then causes what? Well, let's say then in the case of the graphic that's shown here, so this house had 30% damage. People are going to have to move out of that house for 4 or 5 months as repairs are being done. So that comes back to displacement cost. Let's say that this isn't a residential house, but was an actual business. Well, that business has to close now for 4 or 5 months. So you would have a loss of service or a loss of function associated with that. Certain hazard types allow you to also do life safety, avoided injuries or deaths. I will say this, for most of wind and flood events, you don't have these included because of warning time. So usually if there's considered sufficient warning time, those aren't included in a benefit cost. You can imagine for something like a tornado safe room, this is primarily, the whole house disappears and all that's left is the safe room. That's where life safety really comes in. Emergency management costs sometimes can also come in. So let's say you're buying out a neighborhood, and every time the water comes up once a year, the police and fire had to go out to this neighborhood and shut off the roads and get grandma out of the house on the end of the block, and had to do certain things. If you can document those emergency management costs and show that it was isolated to where you're doing your project, that's something that can be then a source of benefit, meaning we would avoid having those costs over time. Where emergency management costs get hard to document for benefits is, let's say there was a major event a couple of years ago, and we had to pay $1 million in overtime to all the police and fire over a month's time to deal with this. If your project is just in a small area or is only impacting a portion of a community, you can't claim that that whole $1 million in overtime from that past event would be avoided by just doing this little small project. So you would have to come up with a way to prorate that, or say, well, that's, during that event, they were out there once every week, and, you'd have to come up with some way to justify that. One other thing that's been added in benefit cost over the last few years is this idea of environmental or ecosystem benefits. In the past, you weren't allowed to add those into your overall benefit cost analysis unless your benefit cost ratio was over a certain threshold. Now, a recent memo has been released that said that there's no longer those limits, so you can include them in. So let's say you're doing a house buyout, and now you're going to turn this neighborhood into a park, and it covers, so many acres of land. The software has built into it some established values for a dollar amount associated with the benefits of setting up those sort of things. Environmental benefits also come back to even things like cleanup. If let's say your project is putting a ring levee around a sewage treatment plant. Well, our event 3 years ago, we had to pay $4 million for someone to come in and clean up the stream downstream from there because we had an overflow and had all these troubles. That would be something that you could then document and have as a source of prevented, again, avoided losses of environmental benefits. Many parts of the software, and if you ever do the longer training or you download the training from the FEMA website, things like loss of function and service, life safety, there are default values built into the software for a lot of these things, so you're not having to guess at this stuff. So that's one thing to keep in mind is say you're wanting to do a generator project and you're like, well, what's the dollar amount associated with power outage? That's something that their default values built into the software that you can leverage and take advantage of. All right, so how does this work within the software? How do the project types are laid out? So when you go into the tool, and you'll actually see similar menus in both the BCA tool and also in FEMA Go, you've got kind of a structure type, whether it's doing something to a building or utility or roads and bridges. So you pick your structure type. Depending on this choice, you'll then have a choice of all these different hazard types. I'll focus today on flood and wind, but depending like roads and or like utilities in the Midwest, you think about your ice storm type of thing. If you're proposing a project to strengthen power poles, then you would pick utilities, and then only a subset of these would come up. And again, you would have to have detailed information about how you would have less power outage with these strengthened poles. But again, that would be an acceptable project type to include. All right, so for flood benefit cost. So what are the major kind of types of projects? Kind of you can group these in kind of three major areas. So acquisition, you're actually buying properties, removing them. Elevations, you're taking that first floor and rising it up. So you're having lower flood depths when events occur. So these two types, the acquisition and the elevations, are looking at avoiding damages by changing what gets damaged, either by removing it entirely or modifying it in such a way that it's damaged less often. Flood control projects, on the other hand, rather than change, and flood control sometimes can also include things like flood proofing, where you also put coatings on buildings and stuff. But usually flood control, doing structural things, you can think of flood walls or berms, or even rerouting rivers or streams. So you're actually changing the hazard itself. So flood is one of the few natural hazards, especially if you're in an area that's primarily dominated by kind of local drainage, where you actually have a chance to alter the hazard itself. But again, thinking of Maryland, you know, in coastal areas, there's not a whole lot you can do against coastal surge, and even like coastal flood walls only are effective up to a certain limit. So those are other things to just always keep in mind, is that each of these project types often will have a limit to their project effectiveness of what they can and can't do. So what I'm going to do is go through a couple of these major project types, and then also show you one of, but not the only, but some of the major data needs that you might have for each of these project types. So for acquisition, you know, it's the purchase, demolition of a building. Sometimes it's also, you can relocate it if in the, you know, if the building is still, you know, sufficiently you know, put together and can be moved. You do have to have caution with that. I will say that I have seen graphics in areas where they go to move a house, but it's in an area where you have to cross roads that have smaller bridges that may not be strong enough to actually withstand the weight of a house crossing it. So I've seen these instances where the bridge collapses under a moved house, and now the house has become kind of the bridge over top. It's a pretty sad. So it's a lot of work to actually do a relocation of a structure, but again, is a possible thing. The nice thing when you do these acquisition projects, and especially if you get full neighborhoods, is you then can convert those areas into open space, into parks, multi-use. One of the big things to always keep in mind with acquisition, though, and FEMA requires this, is that they are then deed restricted to be in as open space in perpetuity. So the either the community or the county or whoever ends up actually owning those properties after the project is done, that's yours to take care of and to keep in open space. FEMA doesn't want projects to, you know, it doesn't want new buildings to go back in those sort of areas. So what's a critical data thing for acquisition? The big one by far is the lowest floor elevation. So in order to get a cost-effective project, the way the math really works is that the lower the building is and the more likely it gets flooded, the higher the benefits, the bigger the benefit by removing that building. What are some good sources for that lowest floor? Ideally, you would have what's known as an elevation certificate. So those are FEMA standard documents that have a very regimented way to go through and have a surveyor get information about ground elevation, building elevations, and not just a single elevation in a structure, but multiple elevations dependent on the way that the building's foundation works and whether it has a basement or a crawl space or slab on grade. It measures multiples of those, and that gives a really solid documentation. In addition, elevation certificates include photography of every side of a building as well. So as a reviewer, if someone wants to buy out a house and they include, a recent or a brand new elevation certificate, that's kind of the gold standard to know, oh, they did their homework and they figured out this house right now is getting flooded by 5-year events. And by removing it, we're avoiding that amount of damage. And to me, it's probably the most critical one for acquisition and really elevation projects as well, is having that level of detail and having it well documented. So elevation projects, so that's kind of a step removed from acquisition. So we're not removing the building, but we're lifting it up. And we're taking it above, at a minimum, the term base flood elevation or your standard 100-year elevation or the basis for your FEMA flood maps. Those are all kind of interchangeable, that concept. But getting a building elevated above that, and in Maryland right now, based on building codes and other things, many areas within the floodplain already have a requirement of have what they known as freeboard, so feet above the BFE. So there's already requirements of at least a foot minimum freeboard based on building codes. But in certain areas and communities, especially communities that are part of the community rating system, you may have a freeboard requirement of 2 feet or 3 feet. So you may actually have it at a higher level, even above that. So elevation projects, the great thing by doing them, especially on older properties that were built at grade or close to grade, so kind of known as pre-firm structures, is you could take a building that's getting flooded, let's say from a 10-year very frequent events, and raise it up high enough that it's going to be avoiding damages now from almost all flood events. Again, elevation projects aren't foolproof. There's not going to, you can never, even elevating it up a couple stories, you can still envision instances, especially if you're right on the coast and other things, where you might, events might be severe enough that it would still cause issues. The other thing with elevation projects is, in a practical sense, while folks like that idea of riding out the storm, there's usually a case just because of lack of electricity and food and other things where you might have to evacuate folks from elevated buildings. So that's another challenge with those project types. So what's a critical thing for part of this project? So in addition to knowing what the first floor is also knowing the number of feet that you're raising the building. So understanding that now that the elevation certificate says my building is at a certain height, and now I'm raising it 2, 3 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. What's that amount to get it above certain flood heights? So in order to derive this number of how many feet to raise this, you would need to know about building codes. You would need to know about the detailed flood profile of the area, and also how feasible it is with the foundation types that you're looking at for a building. If a building's already on piers and piles and you're taking it up and then replacing it with newer ones, that's a little different than a building that's currently on, let's say, cinder block walls and having to convert to the different foundation types. All right, flood control projects. So this is kind of a lump in of a lot of different project types. I've talked about earlier in the talk, like about culverts. You can also think about flood walls. Levees are more common in the Midwest, but we do have them here in the Mid-Atlantic as well. Again, especially in areas, critical facilities, again, like the water treatment plants or wastewater treatment plants often will have ring levees just because they tend to be located next to water bodies. The critical thing with these projects, so one thing to keep in mind is, let's say like with a flood wall, It's really great at preventing the more frequent flood events causing damage. But then there's a point where the water goes over the top, and then it's as if they aren't even there, or the water just goes totally over them. So that's always one thing to keep in mind in a benefit cost. I would expect the after mitigation damages to be, really low, and then when it reaches that threshold, it's going to go over. And then you would basically, that wall effectively is not there for really high events. So in documenting flood control projects, really the critical thing there is damages before and after, before and after mitigation, being able to document what you're seeing and what you're not seeing. So those are flood control. Hurricane wind, I would just say, one of the big project types, and if you guys are looking at the categories they have are shutters, load path, roof retrofit, code plus. Don't have time to get into a lot of it. I'll just talk real briefly about shutters. So what are shutters designed to do? So their design is really to help prevent damages. And in a lot of hurricane wind design, this idea is you want to maintain the envelope of your building. And often windows are a weak point in addition to the roof as well. So what is a critical thing for shutters is really understanding the before and after building properties and what those shutters are designed for. One thing as a reviewer I've often seen on shutter projects is they want to install them in an older building and say, oh, these shutters are designed for 120 mile per hour winds, but then your roof was in an older building is going to get ripped off at 90 miles an hour. So it doesn't really do you much good if the rest of the building is weaker than this new thing you install. So retrofitting structures and adding things like shutters often can be a challenge on an engineering basis, improving and supporting that sort of info. Just repeating on this slide. So some of the other hazard types, you can see the long laundry list here. I would just say, if you're thinking of outside of kind of the standard projects that are done for Maryland, kind of the flood or the wind, and you're looking at some of these others, to do your research and look at what's typically done from a benefit cost ratio and for a project design of those things. And that's where talking with the state can really be helpful as well. If you're, let's say, like that electrical system thing I mentioned, or wildfire, or some of the ones that are a little less typical of what's needed as part of those benefit cost analysis. So what does this tool look like? If you haven't opened it or worked with it, so it's actually an add-on. So you go to the FEMA website, you download some files, and then you add to Excel this add-in where you actually then can activate. This is a screenshot from one of the FEMA trainings, but you actually have an additional button that comes in. It then asks you in the benefit cost analysis for some background information, has drop-down menus for project types, mitigation types, some of the cost info. Notice your project useful life. Couple things about the toolkit if you've worked with it a little bit. So in each of these major sections of the software, if I zoom into this corner, it has this little eye for additional info. It'll pop up an additional screen. And then if you go on one of these little buttons here on the side, it'll expand out. And that's actually where I got this project useful life table from before. Anything in the software, all of these information and these gives you default values and is a real critical place that if you're not, you're going into this and you're just trying to make initial guesses at things, that this can give you some of the critical information to use. Also, if you want to add comments next to some of these values to say, where did I get this information from? Initially, these comments is kind of a white button. And once you populate it, it then shows as blue. But I can type in here, okay, where did I get my project cost from? Oh, detailed project cost is in the cost estimate attached to the grant application. So this allows a reviewer to have additional information as they're going through and saying, where did this value come from? That they can have this comment to help lead them along in knowing where this information is from. When you've completed your benefit cost and you have all your info in, the FEMA Go is going to require you to give it 3 different things. The first is it's going to require you to export the actual project file itself. So this screen shows within the tool where you would hit export projects, and then you would export. In this case, it's showing the Excel file format for the project export. So this project export is the digital file. FEMA Go also wants you to put the project report in. So the report is kind of a PDF formatted printout of all the values that you entered, along with those comments and additional info you might have included. And then the third thing that FEMA Go would want you to have is data documentation. The key thing to keep in mind with this is that every input you put into the software needs to have documentation. Whether you used a standard value, something within acceptable limits, you have an additional engineering study, all of that information has to be supported and documented. Assume that the reviewer isn't going to sit there and go through every study and every attachment in your grant application. You need to have a separate document that steps them through. Cost is here, project useful life is this assumption, before damages are coming from this, after. Take them through every single input so that they know that you've documented and supported that information that's there. So every project, every structure, every input has to have this documentation included. All right, so that's the software. How does this work in FEMA Go? So in FEMA Go, there's two places where benefit cost info goes in. One is under the cost effectiveness section, which has you choose what basis you use for benefit cost, has some additional information to fill out, and then at the end ask for those attachments that I had mentioned earlier. So that's where you would attach the benefit cost tool, export, the report, that supporting data documentation. The other thing in FEMA Go is this location information further down is also going to ask you information about your project site. But when you get to the project site inventory and you're adding information about a building or an individual structure, as part of those underlying menus, they also ask you for the building specific benefit cost info. So that's another place as you're going and filling things out that they're going to want to give you, that they're going to ask for this benefit cost information. So with that, I think, how did we want to go from here, guys? Did we want to do questions at this point?
So I think we can do questions and then, or Kristen, do you want to do the quick slideshow first and then questions?
I think we should do questions first.
Okay, so Shane, I'll go through the chat and get you the questions that people have typed. So first question is, how far into the future can you compute the benefits?
So that project useful life really dictates how far into the future you can go. So when you're entering the information into the software, so let's say like a culvert we're saying has a 30-year useful life, then really those benefits are only coming from those 30 years that we think the project is going to be effective or be able to last. So the project useful life really drives a lot of that. If that's in context of like sea level rise and other things, I would say talk with the state about the best ways to deal with some of those things. That gets more so into the design issues. So like how high you have to elevate a structure. You may decide to elevate it higher because of a sea level rise consideration, but then you would also need a study saying that the future 500-year event is at certain values. So that does get into some gray area of how best to take those things into account. But usually project useful life should be the thing that drives your typical decisions on those sort of things.
Great. Next question is, how do communities quantify the expenses associated with historic flood events?
I would say this, your easiest ways to document historical is to start with official sources. So let's say it's a culvert project and you ask for FEMA public assistance funding from a past damaged event. Like that would be golden documentation where you ask FEMA, well, we had to replace a culvert and fix the road and clean up the stream and all these categories. So if you've got something where from a past event, someone went through and documented those things, great. If not, then that's where you really go back to insurance claims, especially if it's something that's on the public side where they had to, fix and have people go out there and do things, actually look at those historic records for doing those repairs to things in the past.
Okay. Next question is a question about avoided losses. A hurricane affects the entire county. How do you isolate an area which is a sub area of that county? For example, one municipality within the county, and how do you calculate those city costs alone?
That is a good question. I often your project is where your project is being performed is going to drive that area of interest. So if it's a hurricane project and you're putting shutters in a given neighborhood, then really that area of interest, or where there's going to be a difference before and after mitigation, is just that neighborhood where you're putting the shutters. To then prorate past damages from like a whole county to then that neighborhood, that's where you may want to take advantage of like the FEMA helplines and say, we're thinking of, from a past event, it was $2 million, and for this neighborhood, we're going to estimate it was 200,000 that we would avoid. Is that a reasonable thing based on these assumptions? That's where going back and leveraging that FEMA helpline might be good to get some ideas of when you're trying to, something that doesn't have a standard way of doing the math or estimating it, of getting the okay from FEMA that the approach you're using makes sense.
Okay. So question from Brad Rogers. If a flood prevention structure also prevents erosion, can you get credit for that? I'm assuming, can you pick up benefits for the erosion component as well, or what I call secondary or ancillary benefits?
Yeah, it all really comes documenting it, and that whoever documents, let's say, that avoided erosion has, let's say, PE after their name, or erosion specialist, someone who is qualified to come up with the amount of erosion that's happening now, what this project will prevent, and then reasonable estimate of what it would cost to do the repairs from the erosion if it were to happen, in the before mitigation scenario versus the after. So often things like erosion really should have an engineering estimates using things like an RS means or construction landscaping sort of estimates of what it would take to do those sort of fixes. So it needs to be a little bit more than a back of the envelope. So it needs to be done by folks who tend to do those cost estimates for actual real world repairs type of things.
Okay. Next question is to clarify, FEMA Go is where all
Yes.
documents and BCA readouts are submitted, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So the thing to keep in mind is a person who is reviewing the BCA, while they'll have access to the entire grant application, you want to make sure that BCA reviewer has as compact of a description of all the documentation as they don't want to do an Easter egg hunt to find where the cost came from, where the effectiveness came from. So having that summary document that gives each of the inputs and says, this is based on this is based on that. And even to the point where, let's say a study had to be done related to, let's say, a flood wall. If on page 28 of the flood wall study, it says, therefore, it will protect up to this with these dollar amounts, actually saying that in your BCA documentation, go to page 20 of that study, and it summarizes the values that we used here. So that way a reviewer doesn't have to sit there and, like I said, Easter egg hunt their way through all the other attachments to see if what you're claiming in the BCA is reasonable.
Okay. Perfect. What location do you enter if the project has two physically separated locations?
So my understanding, the way that FEMA Go, if I go back to this, they've got project location, benefiting area, impact area, site inventory. Between these four different types, if you look at the description of what they're requiring for each of those, some of them, like a general project area, is just going to be a very like a county or community type of thing. But when you get into these benefiting area and impact area, I believe it gives you the ability to have more than just one area or polygon or locations, but to have multiples. And especially in the site inventory, where you can add individual buildings or infrastructure or even vacant lots that may be part of a purchase, you could definitely can identify more than one site at this level of detail.
Okay. Let's see. Another question, it appears to be the last one in the chat, is one issue I ran into is that contractors, engineers will sometimes say that the project useful life is indefinite if maintained properly. The project associated with this question was a transfer switch and generator. How is that logic reflected in the BCA?
Generators don't last forever. Manufacturers will tell you this. So I would just say a claim of indefinite is going to be rejected outright. And even if someone with PE like me after their name would claim that, usually it would go back to the manufacturer. I mean, you would essentially you would have to prove that something like that is reasonably can be thought of that way. And honestly, I'll give you a little inside thing in the software. Between 30 and 50, that economic formula, you're gaining a little bit of extra benefit, but not a whole lot. But if you're trying to claim something lasts, let's say, for 100 years, it is more worthwhile to use a reasonable project useful life and get other benefits from other types than to argue that it should be given 100 instead. You're probably going to lose that fight most of the time with a FEMA reviewer. So there's other ways to add more benefits that are more reasonable and easy for a reviewer to accept versus this sort of things will last forever, which is just, again, the nature of the way these projects are done. Only an acquisition can really ever justify the 100-year value.
Okay, another question. In the FEMA Open Data Portal, there is an Individuals and Households program, the IHP Flood Damage Financial Information. It does not address commercial losses. Where can they go to find examples of this type of damage cost?
So I guess there's two ways to think about it. If you're doing projects for commercial buildings, the FEMA software, depending on, like if you put in detailed flood information, there are default values for ways of calculating damages for commercial buildings. I mentioned before costing guides like RS Means or Marshall and Swift. They include in their replacement cost values, not only for residential, but also for commercial. So you wouldn't have to rely only on historic. And in fact, that sort of modeled or repair cost is really the basis behind a lot of the detailed flood analysis that's done in there. So the preference would be to have that modeled losses and to use replacement cost guides like RS Means. If you're relying on historical, then really the property owners, they're going to have to give you their insurance claims and their other information directly rather than taking it off of public databases. I worked on a project once for a grocery store, and they had some really quirky damage information about, like they had to like throw out all their inventory if there was any water on it because of health concerns. That was something I had to have them actually put it on a piece of paper and say, the health department told us we had to do X, Y, and Z. And then that was proper enough documentation to then include it in as part. So you really have to work with the property owner when you're trying to get into specifics and details on a commercial site like that.
Okay, so I know there's more questions coming through. We are hitting soon to be the top of the hour. So Jaleesa and Kristen, how do you want to take additional questions that are coming in? And then Kristen, I know you wanted to go over where more information is.
Yeah, thank you. Can you please put the presentation back up, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Great. So just to follow up, if there are additional questions or clarification needed, you can feel free to submit additional questions to the mitigation.mema@maryland.gov website. Also, Shane is going to be pulling up at the end of the presentation. We have a few links. So since we're at the end, I just want to briefly explain those links for you to refer back to. First, we're going to have the mitigation website, which includes content from today along with other resources. The documents and session overview will be up on the website soon. So if you forget anything from today, you can go back and play the video. We'll also be emailing out the resources and the video shortly after the presentation. The second link is the FEMA BCA website, which includes the toolkit, the pre-calculated benefits, and contact information to the BCA hotline. We highly recommend reaching out to the hotline for any technical questions. They've been great in the past at answering questions and providing assistance. And then finally, we have the FEMA Go website for more information. One final housekeeping item: if you called in and your name is not shown, please feel free to send us a follow-up email so that we know who to send the resources from today out to. And as a reminder, if there are any additional questions, refer back to the resources that we've provided on the website in the video. For those of you who have registered for future technical assistance sessions, the environmental and historic preservation presentation will take place next week at the same time. So thank you all for joining today and enjoy the rest of your day.